Let's talk about the railroad industry. Those pages, those section titles are from our old textbook. So early on, the railroad companies in America, the railroad industry serves local markets. It's not a national system. This started in the 1830s, and there were problems preventing it from really being a national network. Most stretches of track were less than 50 miles. Different railroad companies, different tracks had conflicting schedules. Different railroad companies used separate stations. And probably worst of all, different railroad companies used different gauges of track. In other words, different railroads would have these two important beams there on the side. They would be different widths apart for different companies' tracks. But the Civil War points out the need and shows the value of long, efficient railroad tracks. One of the big advantages that the North had over the South was a better railroad system, and it allowed them to move goods and supplies easily and efficiently to troops and to civilians. So we go through a short period of consolidation where large companies are buying out smaller companies. And we also have some standardization in the industry. For example, in 1886, Congress decrees what the standard gauge or standard width between the two tracks is going to be from that point forward. In the East, railroad traffic is dominated by what are called the trunk lines. These are the big main railroad lines that connect eastern markets like Boston and New York and Philadelphia and the seaports on the East Coast with the Midwest and the farmers and the cities and towns of the Midwest, and even connect them to those western rivers like, say, the Missouri River. What the trunk lines essentially do is replace the Mississippi River as a hub of transportation. These trunk lines had feeder lines, smaller lines that fed into the B&O Railroad, that fed into the Erie Railroad, that fed into Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad. So almost all traffic from the Midwest to the East Coast is going through, eventually, these trunk lines. They are linking the northeast part of the United States with the Midwest and cutting out the South. In the South, railroad growth takes a little bit longer. There's really not much capital for investment in railroads because most of that capital is going towards cotton before the Civil War, in land for cotton growth. It's after an influx of investment money from the North and from Europe that the railroad industry in the South really booms in the 1880s. By 1900, the southern states, the Southeast, is fully integrated into that national railroad network. There are also some major technological changes at this time. All of those changes listed over there on the left are going to make railroad travel and transportation after the Civil War faster, more comfortable, or safer. We'll talk more about these in class. And while we're on the subject of standardization, in 1883, the railroad companies create what's known as standard time. So the railroad companies are keeping their own time. Up until that point, individual towns kept their own time, and noon was just whenever the sun was at its highest point. This creates a lot of problems when you're trying to trade by railroad across multiple states. So the railroad companies create standard time. The railroad companies divide the nation into 4 time zones, and Congress does not adopt this practice until 1918, when Congress really needed to rely on the railroad industry to help with World War I transportation. Shifting gears now, let's look at the Transcontinental Railroad. Transcontinental railroads had been discussed since 1845, but sectional disagreement in that era prevented the railroad from being built. Northerners wanted it built in the north, Southerners wanted it built in the south. Starting in 1862, there's no Southerners in Congress. So when Northern congressmen bring it up that year, there's nobody to object, and the project will begin in 1862. Railroad companies received 1 mile of track, for every 1 mile of track that a railroad company would build, they would receive 20 square miles of land in an alternating grid pattern to both the north and south of their track. They would also receive a 30-year loan of at least $16,000. They could get even more if the land that they were building on was difficult terrain, and these would be very low interest loans. As a result of these great deals that the federal and state governments are offering to railroad companies to get them to build railroads, all of that shaded land that you see there at one time or another is owned by various railroad companies. And those long stretches going east to west was land that the federal government gave to railroad companies to build these transcontinental railroads. The Union Pacific is one of the first companies to start construction of a transcontinental railroad. They started in Nebraska, and they're going to head west. Construction on the Union Pacific Railroad really picks up after the Civil War, in part because General Grenville Dodge, who's in charge of the operation, really leverages former soldiers on his labor crews and Irish immigrants. They had to deal with Indian attacks, but one of the benefits is they're going through Nebraska and parts of really mostly flat land for this group. On the other side of the country, through maybe a little bit more rocky territory in the Sierra Nevadas, is the Central Pacific Railroad Company. They start on the west coast, they're going to build to the east. Charles Crocker is in charge of this operation, and eventually he's going to use mostly Chinese workers coming directly from China. Some of them might have arrived as early as the gold rush and now being employed by the Central Pacific Railroad. Those Chinese workers are going to be the ones doing the most dangerous work, blasting with dynamite through the mountains. By 1869, it's completed. It is a symbol of unity for the country. It's also a symbol of progress and engineering optimism. It brings about a more linked economy, heck, even a more linked global economy, because the Suez Canal in Egypt is finished the same year. You'll notice that this photo celebrating the completion excludes Chinese immigrants. By 1893, there are 5 major lines going to the west, and that was probably too many. There is a real problem of overbuilding in the railroad industry after the Civil War. As we get closer to the end of the century, speculators like Jay Gould, stock speculators, drove stock values way higher than they should have on railroad companies. It's estimated that 1/3 of railroad companies' stock was drastically overvalued. In other words, railroad might be worth $10,000, but there might be $20,000 worth of stock floating out there for that company. With this intense competition, railroad companies try to gain an edge on their competitors. And they do that through offering special rates and favors for big businesses. Those would be the most reliable and most profitable customers for them. They offer free passes for large shippers. They offer low rates on bulk. And the most hated practice that they did were what were called rebates. These were secret, private, unpublished shipping rates that they gave to large companies. In 1880, the New York Central Railroad offered 6,000 special rates. Eventually, the railroad companies try to work together to not compete, to try to share traffic. And they formed the Eastern Trunk Line Association. It is not successful, however, as there was really no way to make other businesses keep their word on what they were going to charge and make sure everybody made a profit. At first, railroad companies attempt to again consolidate, with the big ones buying up the little ones, but that didn't prove to be enough. There was just too much competition. And the Panic of 1893 hits in large part due to the railroad industry. 1/4 of those railroad companies go bankrupt. 2 of the trunk lines and 3 of the transcontinental lines go bankrupt. And in steps the banks, led by J.P. Morgan. He's going to refinance the railroad companies. He's going to take care of their bankruptcy problems, pay off their creditors, but that gives him control. And as he has control, he can pick the trustees of different railroad companies, and he tells those trustees, don't compete with each other. By 1900, there were 7 major railroad companies that controlled 65% of the miles of track. And those 7 major railroad companies were controlled by just a few investment banks, like the one owned by J.P. Morgan. This means that the railroad industry is centralized and efficient, but it also means that there's very little competition, which is bad for consumers.